Okay, and welcome back to our presidential tiering. And we have a couple more presidents we're going to add today, and one of the more unusual one, who I could have included in the previous video, but I didn't, and that's Grover Cleveland. I got to be careful as a big baseball fan that I don't say Grover Cleveland Alexander, who is the baseball pitcher named after Grover Cleveland. All right, now the reason that Cleveland basically is elected twice. He's elected before Benjamin Harrison, and then he loses the presidency, and then he comes back and regains the presidency after a 4-year time away. And he's the only president who has ever done that. And some might conjecture or have a possibility that the second one to have that happen might be former President Trump, who is declared his candidacy and is doing very well in polling for the Republican nomination a year out from the election. So that makes him kind of unusual. He's a pretty strong president, actually, and I think his ability to take that lag and then come back shows that overall maybe people realized, hey, this guy wasn't so bad. He really he wants to bring together the nation in trade, and the Interstate Commerce Commission is what is going to try to eliminate state laws. So it's that federalism showing up again, the idea of a strong centralized state. And the Interstate Commerce Commission is going to make trade much easier among the sister states, which is obviously a very important and good thing. Another update to the Navy, and we're going to see that this is going to have immediate, or not immediate, but very real consequences toward America in the very near future. This guy uses the veto 414 times. He absolutely holds a record on using the veto, and not many of them are overturned, which means that he was using the power of the presidency. If something he felt was not going in the right direction of the country, he would put a stop to it and end it, which again, the use of the veto is a very powerful tool. A lot of presidents don't want to do it because they're afraid they'll be overturned. But obviously, Mr. Cleveland was not afraid to do it, and that's an appropriate constitutional use of presidential power, much more than, say, making something a law without really making it a law by disregarding Congress through exceptional amounts of executive orders, which are really, they're not constitutional in a sense. I mean, obviously you have some executive authority, but I think it takes a lot of courage to say, no, we're not doing that, and go back and draw it up again, rewrite it, or do something different. He goes back to the gold standard, which is really important for the economy, especially in this time of rising industrialization and a lot of problems with, you'd have these runs constantly. We talked about a few times these runs where you have real problems in the economy. So going to the gold standard really strengthens the economy. It strengthens the dollar. It leads to a stronger value of American economic power against the world also. So this was a pretty good idea to do. Now, he has a lot of scandals in his personal life that I'm not going to go into because they don't have any bearing really on his presidency. It didn't affect his time in office, really. In the Pullman strike, we have another situation where you have a large strike that's affecting the nation. And he, again, uses federal troops to break it. This is somewhat of a controversial position based on law that, federal troops should not be involved necessarily in internal domestic disputes. That's not their purpose. But he does use it this way. Other presidents have done so. He's not as imperialistic. Harrison was starting to show some real interest in getting into the Pacific, as putting a lot of pressure on Hawaii, as an example. And there's a reason for that. We'll go with that when we talk about McKinley's presidency. So he's not as imperialistic as some. He also has some opportunities to engage and intervene in things that might be considered in American interest, and he chooses not to. So he's somewhat of a non-interventionist, which in the long run, I think it's good because it didn't get America bogged down in some situations that weren't really an existential threat to us, and might have actually diminished our strength and capacity other ways. So we are going to give Mr. Cleveland our comeback kid, and we're going to give him a B. Okay, that brings us to McKinley, who is a kind of a controversial person, and it's really based on your worldview on how you like him. I've seen people who do this type of thing, and historians who rate this guy all the way from one of the better and more important presidents and better ones of all time, and some say he's one of the worst. So it really depends on your personal bias. I'm trying to eliminate that as much as possible. Just when I look at these things, I just try to say this is what happened and what are the outcomes, what are the reasons why, and using the contextual situation. So the United States is at this part that we're becoming an industrial power. We're growing. We have pretty much taken everything in manifest destiny. I mean, we have some territories, but by this time, everything from the East Coast to the West Coast has been settled and is either a territory on its way to statehood or is a state. One thing is that what is our presence in the world, and we get involved in the Spanish-American War, which is probably a war that is it's probably one that will say that I don't think the reason that we gave really happened. The Spanish-American War obviously is the main controversy, where the USS Maine is bombed while in harbor near Cuba, and we blame the Spanish for this. There is absolutely no way. There is no way that Spain bombed the USS Maine. Spain was not in a position to take on the United States, especially in the Western Hemisphere. They were trying to de-escalate a situation. They were trying to control Cuba, which had been a long-term colony that they had, and maintain their influence that they had enjoyed since the 15th century in the Western Hemisphere. I'm not saying that McKinley was part of the conspiracy. I do believe it was a conspiracy that was put out by the American government in some levels. And I'm not alone in this. There's no way the Spanish bombed this boat. Okay, and what happens is a war frenzy comes up. Remember, the Maine becomes the battle cry. The United States grabs so much territory. I mean, so much territory in this war, and this is basically the United States entering the big boys club. We take over Guam. We get partial control of Cuba. We get Puerto Rico. We get a whole bunch of areas, all in this area of the world. We also get into the Far East in the Philippines from this war. So we make tremendous gains. Our Navy now, which has been built up, remember we've been talking about building up the Navy, now we can have a fleet in the Pacific full-time with a place to operate from, and that's the Philippines. But we want another place, and that means that basically his administration is the one that annexes Hawaii. So we basically say, this is ours. We make it into a territory, and the purpose of it is purely to have a military base to guard our western part of this nation from Asia. Now, what would have happened if we had not annexed Hawaii? The Japanese or the British would have taken it over, and they would have a naval base kind of close to our backyard. Not really. Hawaii is very far away, but strategically, we could not let a foreign power. This is the argument that the pro-McKinley people will make. We cannot have this foreign power like Great Britain with probably the best Navy in the world, and Japan, which is also totally revamping their Navy, and it's going to show how good it is because they basically just toast the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War. We could not have this happen. And so we take Hawaii basically as a strategic point to have our Pacific fleet, that it's out in the ocean and not on the coast. And we obviously, Pearl Harbor is the result of the annexing of Hawaii. Hawaii also has it becomes a state later on in the 1950s. Now, one thing that he also does, he puts in the Dingley tariff, and America is kind of showing a trend toward mercantilism, a real heavy protectionism, and the whole aspect of mercantilism is not necessarily the friend of capitalism. It's very much having the state control the economy, and through tariffs, this is one of the way it does it. And this is a big time tariff. It's a large increase, and it stays in effect for like 12 years. So this is a long-term tariff, and the whole idea is to protect American industry, make sure that we stay competitive and not have importation of cheap goods. Our economy was strong enough to do it. So again, if you're a tariff person, if you're a protectionist person with regard to trade, McKinley gets big thumbs up. If you're not, if you're a big free trade person, he gets big thumb down. He also is launching the progressive era, though. He is really starting to talk about civil reform, civic reform, looking at issues that had been long neglected. Women's suffrage is part of the conversation. Workers' rights is part of this conversation. The whole controversy between farms and the cities and things that had been brewing for a number of years. And he really starts taking a very aggressive a progressive stance and trying to look at using kind of like the idea of utilitarianism, what is the best for the most people in this idea. So he has this he's really expansionist, militaristic, bombastic, but he also has this big thing about citizenship and civil reform. This is what you get with McKinley. He is very emotional. He's a very religious man. And he almost approaches these things, imperialism and progressivism at the same time, with like this religious fervor. He also adopts and influences the reconciliation policy between the South. And now this idea, it's not quite as good as it sounds, because what happens is he starts turning more of a blind eye toward the internal policy. That's maybe whereas progressivism doesn't reach out, unfortunately, is to the real problems that are developing up in, down in the South. And this leads to more violence in the South. And the lynching period is getting its start in this time, and it's going to continue, of course, until the for a long time. The lynching period really reaches its height around this time, around the turn of the century through the 1920s. One thing he does, though, with that even though you have this tariff coming on, he increases trade with China. He has an open door policy. In the idea that he's trying to, get trade with China and, make relationships better with China. But at the same time, when you have the Boxer Rebellion, which is really kind of an offshoot of imperialism reaching into China and trying to take control of the economy of China, and various nations of Europe, like in the that had participated in the Opium Wars in the 1840s. They are now participating. You have a rebellion against it, the Boxer Rebellion. America gets in, and they want to get a piece of this Chinese, and they will hold it. Actually, we will hold territories in China that we have a large say in their economy and other things up to World War II. Okay, so this is the high water mark of American imperialism. And again, he has this mercantilist, corporatist kind of financial policy. Now, corporatism is the idea is where you have the state having a large seat at the table and really directing, saying, this is the goals of the American economy. This is where we want it to go. You allow private property. It's not like you have state control property, but you have state control of the direction of the economy. And the idea is that the private companies, they know they have a partner. It's a partnership between private companies and the federal government. And the idea is looking to the needs of the nation. It's a somewhat controversial economic policy. It's a little different than crony capitalism, again, though, because the federal government has a lot more say in the means of production, outlets, price controls, et cetera. So it's more of a state control, but it does have free market aspects of it. A lot about this guy. I mean, and you can look at him and say, well, what is he going to be? I'm going to put him in the middle. I'm going to split the difference, and I'm going to give him, he's another C. He is a very important president. He puts the United States on the world scene, and that's a big deal. But he has some policies that have some long-term effects that are negative, and some of the things that he does, again, they are very much against the traditional non-interventionist, neutral. We're in the Western Hemisphere. That he's really getting us on the world stage, and we are going to do one more, and then we're going to go. So that's McKinley. And if you think McKinley was some strong acting, Teddy Roosevelt is next. And so did we give McKinley? I don't know if we rated McKinley or not. So we're going to have to take, what we'll do is we're going to take a quick break, and I'll be right back. Okay, I'm sorry about that. And I did add our friend McKinley. I'm sorry, I just had a blank moment. And I did add our friend McKinley to the C list. And again, I know many people would put him up here. I know many people would put him down here. Still don't have a lot of D's. All right, let's go with Theodore Roosevelt, who is an amazingly important president, and we're just going to go right now and put him in the top tier. And he is a tremendous president. And I might mention a few things, although it doesn't influence my rating of him, that he did as governor of New York. Theodore Roosevelt had a very close relationship with a New Yorker who is very near and dear to my heart, because my grandmother, my Nana, my grandma was my dad's mom. Nana was my mom's mother. My Nana told me about the importance of Jacob Riis. Jacob Riis was a police photographer who actually went about New York City, and he wrote the book How the Other Half Lives, which deals with the immense poverty of New York City and the horrible conditions that New Yorkers were living in. New York had a director Roosevelt had a position in the New York City government, and he said, "I have read your book. I am come to help." And he absolutely revitalizes and totally makes important, viable changes that are in the public interest, that took care of the horrible suffering of the people, especially the poor in New York City. With education, with healthcare, with housing, et cetera, setting minimal standards for what an apartment should look like. These are important legislations and regulations that save lives. So he is going to follow that. This guy is absolutely fearless, and he is unafraid to go against his party. If he felt this is the direction it should go, he could use the term he uses, the bully pulpit, to whip up public support and do what he felt is right as chief executive. Now, some don't like this kind of presidency, and I understand that. But when we look at Roosevelt's policies, the positive gains that they have for the nation are tremendous. So he's a strong leader. He's fearless. He's principled. He does not care. Sometimes he's reckless. He really dislikes compromise, because he's the idea, if it's right, and it's right. But you have to look at his decisions and say, where do they affect America? So let's look at some of them. So he's weird. Conservative people who tend to be to the right of center, and with all that represents, and progressive, each will have a lot to say. This is why I love Roosevelt, which maybe is a good thing. He really transcends that whole progressive versus conservative issue that we have today, which is actually very hard to kind of figure out, because it's lost so much in the meaning in the last 20 years, what it really means to be a conservative. All right, let's go with this. He's an environmentalist. He's the first environmentalist president, and he is radical about this. He sets up the national park system. So think of how many people's benefit from our country's history, our country's beauty, our natural resources, by setting up the national park system, which is going to be important to legislation such as later on the Environmental Protection Act, which I understand people disagree with it, but who does it benefit and who does it necessarily hurt? It doesn't really hurt the common person nearly as much as hurts someone who wants to develop land that is preserved. So he's setting up the preservation of certain areas. He proposes healthcare reform. He sees how much the people are suffering, especially the working class and the working poor, and a minimal of healthcare. He is one of the strongest proponents of some type of nationalized healthcare that had already been applied in certain successful industrial nations that had capitalism. So he is one of the first ones to do that. He is not able to go with it. He does choose to run in 1912, which kind of hurts the Republican Party and makes the Republicans lose the election, because he wants another term, and he's not the Republican candidate, so he goes like a third party route with the Bull Moose Party, and he does not do well. He is a trust buster. He sees the crony capitalism and how corporations have gained so much power and unwitting power, and are really basically just making themselves rich at the expense of so many people and so many resources. And he starts going after these trusts. He files the federal government during his presidency filed 44 antitrust suits, and they win most of them. So it's not like he's picking something. He has real valid concerns, and he goes ahead and gives that. He is absolutely one of the most anti-corruption, especially in business. So he's kind of a justice. justicialist. We would call them basically people who want justice for the common person and the good of the nation, and understanding that this that corruption in business and in government is never good for the nation. And he also goes after corruption like a dog after a bone. He passes the Pure Food Act. So this is something that affects every American's life day by day. There was absolutely no regulation in the food industry, and people were dying from spoiled canned goods, rancid meat, etc. And he puts in minimal standards at the federal level because, again, we are an interstate nation. We have many states that are involved in this, and you can't have one rule for food purity in one part of the country and the other, because things are crossing state lines and goods are although food at this time was not as nationalized as it is today due to the lack of refrigeration and electricity, it still is happening. So, and again, so every time you don't get sick from something that you eat, well, thank Teddy Roosevelt. So he's, again, he's having all these things. These are all, again, to protect workers because the conditions at these factories were absolutely unsafe, and consumers. And basically the fact that, again, using the construct of utilitarian progressivism, what benefits the most? And that's what the federal government needs to do. It's because the federal government's job is to protect the people. That is the country. The country is not just, the country is the people. And I think he really has that idea. Another thing he does, he's not afraid to talk to the press. He doesn't hide from the press. And that's one of the worst things some presidents do, is they just kind of have this bunker mentality. He engages with the press. That doesn't mean that he coddles them. He's, but he meets with the press regularly. The construct of press conferences, that's his idea. And that's very important to have transparency in government and to have, the press do its appropriate role of being the watchdog of democracy, and not being necessarily taking on one partisan side or the other, but being that disinterested party, but it's looking at, okay, how is this functioning as far as constitutionality? Obviously, newspapers have opinions. That's part of their process. But if you look at many newspapers today, it's basically an opinion sheet, not really a fact sheet. And it needs to be very heavily fact-based, I would argue. And I'm not saying it from either side politically. I'm just saying that journalism has suffered. But one area that Roosevelt is very positive is having this idea of connecting regularly with the press and inviting them in. So one thing he does, and is he a dealer in hope? All these things, if you don't see these things as hopeful for the people, well, you and I will disagree. And he uses the bully pulpit to move public opinion and make people aware of it. I mean, some of the things that we've talked about now, should we have preserves of land that the whole citizenry can benefit? Now, I understand that not everyone can get to these things, but to have national parks, to have a concern about our environment and the natural beauty and the natural resources of the United States, to have clean air, to have clean water, to have clean food that doesn't kill you when you eat it. These are things that benefit the people and gave the people hope, and made him a very popular president in his time, a very effective president. So he is in the top four. And again, out of these top four, we will have a couple of Supremos. They are head and shoulders. They are so good that we have to even give them an A+. And we're going to have one that is the greatest president, in my opinion, and based, I think, on a lot of data, of all time. So we're going to stop this now because I think we're leaving on a high note, and we will be back at another time with more of the presidents of the United States. Have a great day.